Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Managerial Accounting. If you're tuning in, I want to thank you and then also take a minute to congratulate you because right now you're about 25% of the way done with the class. The light at the end of the tunnel is quickly coming up. I know some of you probably doesn't feel that way as you're reading the book and you're like, what in the heck are we doing? But we will make it to the end. What I wanted to do today is I wanted to take a step backwards and look at normal costing, which we completed in our last chapter, and then use that information to go forward and look at activity-based costing, which is in our next chapter, and kind of compare and contrast the two. And we're going to use one example to do that. And we're going to work that example looking at it from a normal costing standpoint and then an ABC standpoint. And I hope that in doing so, it will make both of the topics here become clear. So let's get to it. And now I mentioned having an example drawn up and typed up. And you can get this example on Blackboard if you're not on campus or you're watching me from somewhere other than Southern State and you want a copy of the document that I have here, you can get that from me. Just email me and I'll send it to you. But here's all the details behind the problem that we're doing. It gives you all the data, and then the questions that we're trying to answer are on page number 2. So if you want to see all that in one place instead of spread out all over this lecture, then feel free to download that. And even though we haven't gone through that many chapters, we've spent a lot of time talking about product cost and how to come up with it. And by now you should know that product cost is going to be made up of 3 different things. It's going to be made up of your direct labor, it's going to be made up of your direct material, and anything that isn't direct labor or direct material is going to go into overhead. We add up overhead to direct material and direct labor, and that gives us our product cost. For the most part, direct labor and direct material don't give us a whole lot of trouble in tracing it to the product cost. Where we run into problems is on the overhead side of things, and a lot of what we do in managerial accounting is coming up with different ways to trace that overhead to the product cost. We talked in chapter 3 about normal costing, and that's the example we'll look at to begin with. So we'll start with our old friend normal costing. Hopefully you remember a little bit about that. As I said before, direct material and direct labor don't give us a whole lot of problems regardless of the method we're using. We can trace that directly to the product cost. And overhead, we learned in normal costing how to come up with a budgeted overhead rate or a predetermined overhead rate, and then use that to apply overhead to the individual products using a cost driver, and in most cases direct labor hours. So that's kind of where we've been. Well, let's kind of rehash that using an example. We've got Mojo Bob's Freezer Pizzeria. They manufacture quality frozen pizzas that come in 2 different varieties, hand tossed and pan. And they're trying to determine their cost per pie. So what they've done is they've gathered all the overhead cost information they've had, and we've got that right here. Now keep in mind, these are all overhead amounts. Not direct material, not direct labor. If it's not either of those, it gets dumped into overhead. So they've got material storage and handling. They've got oven and freezer set up. They've got the depreciation on their machinery. They've got the factory building, depreciation, taxes, insurance, utilities, that kind of thing. And then they've got kind of a potpourri catch-all called other manufacturing overhead. You add all that together, and they've got a total budget for overhead of $1.25 million. A few more details. They've had a recent production order for the 2 different categories, hand-tossed and pan, and they need to make 30,000 hand-tossed and 15,000 pan. So you see the direct labor hours that it's going to take to do that, the material cost involved, the number of production runs they have to make, and the number of machine hours involved. So that's the setup. Here's what we need to calculate. We need to, assuming a $5,000 budget for direct labor, we need to calculate the predetermined overhead rate or the budgeted overhead rate per direct labor hour. We're going to calculate the total overhead cost that would be assigned to the order for both hand-tossed pizzas and pan, and then we need to determine the overhead cost per pizza in both orders. So I'm going to pause right here, and if you want to try to work that out on your own, I'll give you a chance to do that, and then we'll pick back up and show you the solution for it. We want to come up with the predetermined or budgeted overhead rate per direct labor hour in 1A. And the formula for that, total budgeted overhead divided by the budgeted level of activity. We decided early on that the total budgeted overhead was $1.25 million, and the problem says our direct labor budget is going to be 5,000 hours. So that's our level of activity. If we divide those two, we come up with a direct labor hour amount of $250. So that's going to be the allocation that we're going to make, $250 per direct labor hour. Number 2 says calculate the total overhead cost that will be assigned to the order for hand tossed and the order for pan peaches. The rate is $250. We just calculated that. So we need to find the direct labor hours for hand tossed and the direct labor hours used to make pan pizzas. That information was given earlier. It looks like 40 direct labor hours for hand tossed and 20 for pan. So we'll plug in 40 and we'll plug in 20 and we'll go ahead and do the math here. 250 times 40 direct labor hours is going to be $10,000. 250 times 20 is going to be $5,000. So we're going to assign or budget $10,000 of overhead for the hand-tossed pies and $5,000 for the pan pizzas. Number 3, if we're going to determine a overhead cost per pizza, all we really have to do is take those amounts and then divide them by the number of pizzas that we're going to make. We had an order for 30,000 hand-tossed and 15,000 pan pizzas. So all we're going to do is take our total assigned overhead and divide it by the number of units we're making. In both cases, we get 33 cents of overhead per hand-tossed pie and for the pan pie. We take that applied overhead amount that we calculated and add it into our direct material and direct labor and kind of pull everything back together, and we see that we get a cost per pie for the hand tossed of $1.86 and a cost of $3.03 for the pan. If you want to know how I came up with the direct material and direct labor numbers and you can't figure that out, shoot me an email and I'll share you. But that's kind of an important number. You know, a lot of businesses will take a cost of their product and then use that as a jumping off point to determine what to charge a customer. So obviously if we think it's costing us $3.03 to make a pan pizza, we're not going to sell it for any less than that. We may look at what the competitors are charging and say, okay, well, maybe we can get away with $3.50 and still make a profit and get a product that's going to sell. That's normal costing, and you know there's a lot of shortcomings with it. It's not the end-all be-all. What we need to talk about are some of the things that are wrong with normal costing, and the big one is right here. You're only using a single driver to allocate that overhead. If we look back at our problem, we were using the direct labor hours to kind of allocate overhead, but look what happens here. Our pan pie is 20 direct labor hours. Our hand tossed is 40. So the hand tossed is twice as labor intensive because you have to have people throwing the crust in the air and catching it over and over to get it ready. So we're talking about allocating $1.25 million of overhead, but we're doing it in a way that really isn't fair to the hand tossed because the pan pizza is really getting half of the overhead allocated to it that the hand tossed is due to the direct labor hours. So if we're only going to use one driver, it becomes hard to make sure that we're doing an accurate allocation of overhead. The second big shortcoming is the fact that we have a very high-tech manufacturing environment nowadays. In the old days, our manufacturing in the United States was very direct labor based, meaning you had a lot of people on an assembly line putting things together. Well, now that we have a lot of technology in factories, we have a lot of robots and things like that, we've essentially gotten rid of a lot of direct labor and replaced that with machines that do the work for us now. So we really have a big emphasis on overhead now, whereas in the past we didn't really have a lot of overhead because a lot of what we did was direct labor. So the kind of another problem with normal costing is it's not designed to handle a whole bunch of overhead. The third issue we have is we have multiple product environments in most factories now. In the old days, maybe we only made a product or two, but now factories are cranking out a lot of different products, and the more products you have, the harder it becomes to allocate overhead to those products. So normal costing, it was okay for a period of time, but in today's modern environment, we need something a little bit more detailed. So that's where ABC comes in, activity-based costing, and that's what we're going to look at in our next video using the same example.